On server, we see, okay, we're running, right, localhost 3000/Pokemon. Let's just open that up in the browser, right? Let's see what happens. It's JSON, right? I actually have a tool that sort of like prettifies your JSON, makes it look a lot more structured. I definitely recommend if you're working in JSON, like with APIs, like going forward, you're gonna be. So download a tool like this. I think I just looked up like JSON Prettier Chrome extension, like ages ago. JSON View, I think, is a good one. JSON Formatter, also a good one. I'm pretty sure I have JSON View installed. But either way, we can see, okay, cool, we have an array, and each of these arrays has one object, and this object represents a whole Pokemon. Actually, it goes all the way here. Cool, so we can probably use this to populate our web page. The prompt for this work also gives a sample markdown, so we've included a sample of the HTML that you can use to style your Pokemon cards. Again, like I said this morning, we're writing the HTML, and we are also going to be, creating the JavaScript to manipulate the DOM. But sometimes you don't want to deal with the HTML. Like, for example, on the code challenge next week, we might give you a little bit of help, right? We might say like, hey, here's some info that like you don't have to think about what HTML looks like. You just need to think about JavaScript because that's what the JavaScript needs to be. But you're going to get plenty of practice writing your own versions of this, and you should take that practice as well. All right, so what I have here so far is on DOM content loaded. I created this all Pokemon data. It's just an empty array right now. We might add stuff to it. From my index.html, I've loaded Pokemon container. It's just a div. Right now it says there are no Pokemon here. I've also loaded Pokemon search form into a variable. Pokemon search form is this entire form. We're probably going to they're playing evolution. We're probably going to use this form as well to take some input from the user. And then this is what we started with this morning, right? I did a fetch. I wrote here method get. It's implicit, but if you don't write what the method is, it's always going to be get, right? And then after this fetch, we say take the response object, turn it into JSON, right? Just like we did this morning. And then given the Pokemon JSON data, we're saving it in this variable, right? And then we're setting the inner HTML of our Pokemon container as render all Pokemon. This is a different method from what you used before. I'm going to actually do it in two methods, show you both, but it's important that you know that they both exist, and you can choose whichever one you want to do going forward. So that's like the baseline of the app. Before that, let's just take a step back and like ask like why do we want to do this using async information? I chatted about it a little bit this morning, but who thinks they have an idea? Like why is it important to do this asynchronously? Aaron? The API could be really huge. I'm sorry, I lost the last thing you said. Right, we don't want the user to have to wait for the API. Like, the app can wait, the user shouldn't have to wait, right? Let's say they want to like play around with the web page while these are still loading. They have the authority to do that. Okay, so cool. So the first way we're going to do this is actually the way we've been using, which is like we're just going to append children to our Pokemon container, right? So let's come in here. Let's put in a binding.pry. Let's even make sure, that's wrong, debugger. Wow. Put a debugger in. Let's just make sure that we do the fetch, that we get the JSON data, and then we set it as all Pokemon data, right? Okay, so we've hit this debugger. What is all Pokemon data? It's 150. It's an array of 150. And each of these is an object. So this is terrific. So we've got the information we need. And probably here, like we're talking about like organizing our information, right? Let's make a helper method. Let's make a method that's like, function make Pokemon div, right? And we'll have it take a Poke object. So that Poke object is an object that represents one Pokemon. So one of these, and what we'll do is we'll have that generate a node that looks like this. Cool? So just to start, we can say, okay, like Pokemon card div equals document dot create element, right? Div. We'll also set Pokemon card div dot class to be Pokemon card, right? And then we want this Pokemon frame div inside of the Pokemon card, right? So we'll say Pokemon frame div equals document dot create element div, right? We'll say Pokemon frame div dot class equals Pokemon frame. Then we'll go in and say, okay, then let's append the Pokemon frame to the Pokemon card, right? Because the Pokemon frame is the first child of Pokemon card. So we'll say Pokemon card div. Actually, I just want to call these by like Pokemon card, Pokemon frame. Okay, Pokemon card dot append child, Pokemon frame, right? Then we want to add an H1, right? So we'll say Pokemon name, right, equals document dot create element H1. We'll say Pokemon name dot text content, and this is where we actually want it to generate dynamically from the Poke object that we passed in, right? So this Poke object has all this information in it, including a name. So we'll say text content equals Poke object dot name. Then we'll say Pokemon name dot class equals center text. All these classes exist for styling. We already have some style in the app, so once we add the entire div, it should be styled nicely, which is why we're setting the classes on everything. Cool. We want to add Pokemon frame. We want to add Pokemon name to Pokemon frame. So we'll say Pokemon frame dot append child Pokemon name. Then let's go in. We'll say div. No, we'll make another div, right? We're gonna make Pokemon image, right? So we'll say Pokemon image equals document dot create element div. We'll say Pokemon image dot class equals Pokemon image. Then we'll say Pokemon frame dot append child Pokemon image. And then finally, we are going to add the actual image, right? And this is going to be like, maybe we'll just say actual image. And you know what? I wish I had just done this before. I'm going to go in and add let in front of, or actually I'll just add const in front of all of these because we're not going to rechange the name. Actual image equals, right, document dot create element image, img, and then we'll say actual image dot data actual image dot data ID, and I need to make sure we know exactly how to set the right data, so maybe it has to be dataset.id, right? So remember before we were getting it from calling dataset when it had data dash something, so we're going to do the same thing. Loon?
Do you need constant in front of the classes?
No, we don't. I just added it everywhere because I was like, I should have done this before. Okay, let's see. We don't need that here. We only need it when we create a new variable, right? Okay, thank you.
Would it break if you got to do that?
Yeah, I think it would be like you're trying to create a constant where like this isn't even a word, right? And also, where's the equals, right? So JavaScript would be like, what's going on? This is not how I'm used to using the word constant. Okay, so we're set dataset.id, and this looks to be like the Pokemon's actual ID, so we can grab that from this ID attribute. Bless you. So we'll say PokeObject.id, and then this has a data action. I think the data action has to do with the CSS, so we'll just do actual image.dataset.action, and let's just call it flip. Say actual image.class equals toggle sprite, and then we'll get to the source, which is just whatever the source that probably comes through from the API. So we'll probably take, let's just take sprites front. So we'll say actual image.source equals PokeObject.sprites.front. And then we will add, I'll get to you in a second, John. We want to add the image tag to the Pokemon image div. So we'll say Pokemon image.append child actual image. Yeah, what's that?
What is
Sprite is just a word used in the Pokemon world to mean the like the 16 by 16 pixel art of that Pokemon. It's not something has anything to do with JavaScript. It's just like I know it because I played a lot of Pokemon and I know this API. Yes, Steve.
where are you getting the data set from? In line 20, do you need the const?
In line 20, did not need the const here. Thank you. Okay, so the way a data set works is that in HTML, if you have data dash something, that doesn't translate to JavaScript. Like you can't have a variable in JavaScript called data dash ID. So the way they set it up is that they have this data set object which has different keys, and each of those corresponds to whatever the word is that is on the other side of this dash. Okay, and then finally we need to return this entire div. So we'll return Pokemon card. Yes,
Just go back to the data set. You're setting that because it's in the Pokemon API.
I'm setting it to match to this HTML, but I'm getting the ID from the Poke object, right? But the action, I'm just calling it flip. I don't actually know what it does yet. So what we have here is like this really like complex. It was almost tedious to write this out, right? Right. This is why we're going to show you the other way as well. It might look a lot more intuitive, but this is just like this is what it's like to go line by line and use document.createElement. You know, sometimes it's not exactly the best way to do something. That being said, let's see if it works, right? Because this is how we've been creating elements and working with the DOM so far. Let's see if this actually works. So I'm going to keep this debugger. I'm gonna call on like one of the all Pokemon data. I'm gonna call the make Pokemon div and see what we get. So let's say make Pokemon div on all Pokemon data 0. We have a div, another div, Ivysaur, DevTools is disconnected, wonderful. But we got some of the functionality that we wanted. Oh, and we managed to add it to the page as well. Right, so here I called, wait a second. Oh my God, let's get rid of all of this. That's why that worked. Let's come back here. Cheats. Okay, so we have what's it called? We can create our div by saying render. We can create our div by saying make Pokemon div, right? Make Pokemon div with that first all Pokemon data. Makes the div. Let's actually append these to our Pokemon container and see what happens, right? So I'm going to go in here. Let's do it for, I'm going to comment this out. We'll come back to this. So I go in and I say, okay, all Pokemon data.map, or let's say for each, and then for each Poke object, we will, div equals, or let div equals make Pokemon div for that Poke object. Then we'll say Pokemon container dot append child, and that will be the div. See how that looks. Right, so we created some divs. Actually, what happened here was that our classes weren't set. We saw that before, right? So something happened here where the class hasn't actually set. Let's look it up real quick. So how to set class on DOM node. Okay, so here it says d.className, Maybe that's what we did wrong. So coming back here, I'm gonna come and change all of these classes to class name. Let's try this again. Cool. So this is one way setting up our Pokemon cards, right? We went in, we created element over element over element, appended them in the right places. Imagine if you made a mistake here. It'd be pretty hard to like reconcile that, right? It'd be hard to know whether or not you made a mistake, or you'd have to debug line by line. So an easier way to do this, in a way that's a lot more common, is actually setting the inner HTML of the parent node, right? So what we can do here is we can say, like, create, well, let's keep this just as an example. I'll just keep this up here and comment this out. Let's go in and create a, function, generate HTML text for Pokemon, right? Let's be really explicit about what this is going to do. And it's going to take a Poke object as before, but this time what we'll do is, let's just go in, take this entire string, and throw it in a series of backticks. So what this means, and I'm going to fix the indentation, because if this is indented properly, we'll actually know what it does. Okay, I think that this looks right. Cool. So this is our string. It doesn't actually like highlight as HTML. Fortunately, that's just kind of how it is. But what we get to do here now is we can interpolate, like, oh, Poke object dot name, right? We can interpolate Poke object dot ID. We can interpolate Poke object dot sprites dot front. Right, so this really lets us generate this HTML. Of course, it's a string, but thanks to the inner HTML function, we can go in and set this up just exactly the way we want it to. So this generates HTML tests for one Pokemon, right? We probably wanted to generate some HTML tests for each individual one, right? So what we can do is, I don't know, something like this. Here we actually have this. We have this function, right? Pokemon container.innerHTML render all Pokemon. I'll take this part, I'll copy it and put it on top. So we can use the following callback with make Pokemon div, and then I'll post it here. Just comment it out. So we've got render all Pokemon. I'll make a function render all Pokemon. And one thing you notice, we have a second file here, right? Event handlers.js. One thing that could be interesting is we start to modularize our code, right? So what we'll do is we will take these two functions. Let's say maybe all of the functionality that deals with creating new HTML, right? Or calling back to the fetches. Let's have it go into event handlers.js, right? If we go into index.html, right, we're linking both event handlers and index. Right, and we're linking event handlers first, which means whatever functions we define here, we have access to in here. Now when I call render all Pokemon with all Pokemon data, it'll call this function, which means that this file can really, really stay focused on maybe doing the fetches and handling user input. Like, it can be about events. And this file can be about the change in the DOM. Yes, Lynn?
If you're calling event handlers first, how is it getting all Pokemon data?
This is a parameter that's passed in.
Oh, okay.
Right, so let's make sure, as a rule, we can say all of the event handlers we define have to take in all of their information from their params, which means they have to be pure functions. Right? They don't care about the outside world. They do in a way, right? Like clearly this HTML text knows what the class names should be, and it knows what the structure should be, but none of the data comes from anywhere but its own argument. Okay, so render all Pokemon. What I wanted to do is generate a string that represents all of these divs. So maybe what we can do is say, like, all Pokemon data.map, and then for each Poke object, we can actually just go ahead and return generate HTML text for Pokemon. Actually, we can even just pass in generate HTML text for Pokemon just like this, because it's automatically going to pass Poke object in and then return this return value, right? And now we need to make sure that this actually returns this div. So maybe we can do something like this. Cool. So we're returning this entire string. Let's see what this mapped, what this map actually creates. So we can say let divs equals this, and I'm going to actually, let's call it div strings. Let's put a debugger in here. Okay, unexpected identifier line 54. Let's refresh. Cool. I hadn't saved the page. Okay, so if I look at div strings, it's 150 div strings, right? Maybe what we want to do is create one big string, right? If I want to take an array of strings and make it one string, how can I do that? What function can I use? I want to add every string to each other.
Reduce?
Who said that? Correct. We can use reduce because reduce, just like with a sum, takes an array, or you call it on an array, allows us to reduce the multiple values into one value. So we're going to take an array of multiple strings and turn it using reduce into one string. Called div strings.reduce, and I believe reduce has an accumulator, which is actually our final string, and then each individual string, right? So I'll be really explicit. And we're going to start with an empty string, but what we want to do is for each string, we want to return final string plus individual string. And can you add strings like that in JavaScript?
Yes.
Yes? Cool. I don't know for sure, so let's take a look. A plus B. Cool. That's what we want to do, right? Let's see if this works. And so now we want to return the final value of reduce. So we're going to put a return on top of that as well. And we're going to save that as the inner HTML of Pokemon Container. So Pokemon Container, right, inside of, where are we? Inside of, oh, there's index.js. Inside of this div, we are going to, by setting inner HTML, the other thing that we do is we lose all of that. Actually, we lose everything from here to here, right? Because we're getting rid of it. We're resetting it. But we're going to get a bunch of divs. Should be cool. Should be what we're looking for. Let's see. Undefined. This is so sad. Okay, let's see what happened. Maybe the first thing we can do is debug this, so we can say let reduced equals, then we'll put a debugger here, and we'll return reduced, because that was what was happening before. Okay, so our reduced, this looks like what we wanted. So that's good. Right, we got some Pokemon cards. So what happened? So this return value is cool. That's what we wanted. Let's go back and, oops, let's just make this the return. Maybe we can come in here. We can say like all Pokemon equals, say let all Pokemon equals this render. And we can put a debugger right here. So that looks good. For some reason, when we call Pokemon container.innerHTML equals all Pokemon, gave us undefined. No, it didn't. Wow. Let's remove the debugger and see if it still works. Okay, there must have been a bug in the earlier version, something that had not been saved. How come I what?
You're missing the very first one. Just from my Pokemon.
Oh, how come we don't have Bulbasaur? I think the API is messed up, to be completely honest. Because, what's it called? If we look at our db.json, we start with Ivysaur. So that's just like pretend the API is wrong. But I agree, it's a massive oversight. I'll fix it before the second half of this lecture. Okay, so that's the read, right? I think before we have to break at 230, we can probably achieve delete a Pokemon on click of a button, right? So there isn't really a button here to delete a Pokemon. Maybe we can just add a tiny button in each Pokemon card, right? So we'll say something like, where is it? We have event handlers. So right here, before the Pokemon frame, or maybe right after the name, let's just add a little button, right? Class equals, something. Let's forget the class. Let's just say button, and then let's have it be X, and close the button. So now each of these has a little X, right? Cool. And let's see. One thing we can do is we can go in and see, like, let's give it a class of, I don't know, delete button. Right, so now we can actually get these delete buttons in our index.js. So looking here, let's, like we said before, we're gonna put all of our like getters elsewhere. So we'll say const get buttons equals document dot query selector, and we'll say class delete button, and maybe we'll just call this delete buttons. Question: when I first load this page, how many buttons am I going to see in delete buttons? When I first load this page, who has an idea? Who thinks they know? So how many delete buttons will? I mean, it's happening before the fetch. So yeah, so 0. So when you're rendering something dynamically, right? When you're talking to the backend, and you're like, hey, I need the backend's information to populate the page, and then I'm going to put some buttons on there. You can't just get your delete buttons like that. You almost have to wait until you've set all your Pokemon, right? And then we can do the delete buttons. But probably the way I would do it is I would do like maybe make another callback here, something like function after load Pokemon, right? And like this is where the rest of the setup of the page goes. And then I would do like setting up the delete handler here. And once you've set your inner HTML, right, then we can say call after load Pokemon. Right, so it happens after we load. So we've got all the delete buttons now. If I look at, let's just console.log delete buttons.length. Yikes, that's no good. First of all, this is query selector for class. Let's do a query selector all, because we want to get multiple of them, right? Obviously, you can't call .length on a single node, right? Okay, so we got 150. That means that it's a good time for us to go in and set an event handler. So we'll say delete buttons for each button. What I want to do is button add event listener on click. So when that particular button is clicked, right? Let's just take a look at what the event gives us. What's the event target? What can we play with? So I'll put a debugger in here. I just want to call out explicitly, I'm sure you're all noticing this, like when I'm building this stuff, every time I do something new, I just put a debugger in, see did that work, right? Because if I'm just taking it step by step. At the end of the day, if you do like 3 or 4 steps at once and then it breaks, it's hard to know which of those steps broke, right? So it might take an extra like 10 seconds every single time, but if you want to know for sure that what I set up works, this is how you do it. Okay, so we have an event, it's a mouse event. We have target, right? And that's this button. The tough thing is this button doesn't really give us any information about which Pokemon we click the button on, right? So if I was like E.target, delete button X, like cool, let me click Blastoise, right? E.target, whatever, it's all the same. So what we want to do is actually get to, what's it called? We want to get to this data ID, because that's the Pokemon object's ID, right? Or we want to get to the backend ID, right? So the way I would do it is we can just give the delete button that information using, we can give that delete button information using like data backend ID equals, and then we'll interpolate PokeObject dot, well that's actually what the ID is, right? We can just call it data ID, give it PokeObject dot ID, right? If we do it that way, now let me refresh, click one of the, click Charmeleon. Now I have e.target.dataset.id. Cool. We actually have something we can work with, right? So one thing that's really helpful when you're setting all this stuff is make sure that your data ID is actually in a relevant place. It tells you, where can I get this information? Where am I going to need this information? Usually it's where the event's being called, right? And because we're just generating this HTML, right, we can decide what information we give the event handler and what information gets stored on the target. Okay, so now that I have that, maybe we need to trigger a fetch, right? We want to trigger a fetch delete. There's two things actually that need to happen. First is we want to tell the backend, delete this Pokemon from your backend, right? The second is we want to remove the DOM node, or remove the Pokemon from the DOM. So I could easily just go in and be like, okay, we want to remove this Pokemon div, which is, right, this is the button's parent's parent, right? So you can go like e.target.parent element, right? That's the Pokemon card. I could easily just do something like this, right? e.target.parent element.remove, right? So if I did that, gone, right? Yeah?
I'm probably just misunderstanding, but I feel like we use the word node to refer to a bunch of different things. Can
Yeah.
you, just briefly explain what exactly, is a node the same thing as an element?
The node, for the most part, functionally, the node and an element can be used interchangeably. It's really just some of the objects are called nodes in JavaScript, some of the objects are called elements in JavaScript. It really depends on which query selector you use. So here, if I looked at let's why don't we just go ahead and bring the debugger. Well, let's bring the debugger back from before we remove the element, right? So I'm going to click Blastoise, then we look at e.target.parent element, right? This is both an element and a node. It's really the distinction that comes into play is when we're talking about I'm going to use document.query selector all, and let's say I want all of the buttons, right? Then you get a node list. But then if I was document.find all by, what is it? Document.find element, find elements by class name, and then I was what do we call this button? Delete button. It might just be find elements by class. It is class name. Document, it's get elements by class name, right? Get elements by class name. Then it gives you a HTML collection, but the element inside is always the same. So this button, delete button, and if you go to the node list, well, I said buttons here, so let's do document.query selector all button, right? This, it's called a node list up here, but this element, or this node, exactly the same thing. So I'm using them interchangeably. I think probably the more common nomenclature is the word element, but if you think about, like, if you remember that in the events lecture we had like a little diagram of like a tree where all of like the different HTML DOM nodes or DOM elements like were connected to each other. In that context, you can call it a node because a tree's individual like items are called nodes. Just get used to using them both, but probably use element more if you're gonna pick one. Okay, so let's change this again. So we were able to, we're able to affect the DOM, but we want to do CRUD, right? We want to like go in and actually like affect the backend. So best way to do that is by making a fetch, or really the only way to do that, sending a request to the backend, right? And I'm gonna get kicked out of here in 3 minutes. So I would rather, instead of rushing through it, I'd rather just come back at the start of the next hour and just do it properly. Sound good? Okay, thanks everyone.